The champagne flute shattered against the marble floor, a sound as sharp and final as a gunshot. Every head in the sterling grand ballroom, a sea of couture gowns and bespoke tuxedos, turned towards the source of the commotion. Eleanor Sterling, matriarch and empress of this opulent world, was staring at her manicured hand, now dripping with champagne and a single perfect bead of blood. But her horror was not directed at the minor injury. Her gaze, a shard of ice, was fixed on the small, smudged girl standing before her. The child couldn't have been more than 8, dressed in clothes that were little more than rags, her face streaked with the grime of the city. She clutched a small worn wooden box to her chest as if it were the only thing holding her together. "Get this thing out of my house," Eleanor hissed, her voice a low, venomous tremor that cut through the sudden silence. 2 burly security guards in sharp black suits began to move, their faces impassive. The girl didn't cry out. She simply stood her ground, her large, startlingly familiar hazel eyes fixed on Eleanor's. As the guard's hands clamped down on her thin shoulders, a voice, cold and laced with an authority that dwarfed even Eleanor's, echoed from the grand entrance. "Let her go." The crowd parted like the Red Sea. Standing there, silhouetted by the grand doorway, was Damian Sterling, the estranged eldest son, the phantom billionaire who hadn't set foot in this house in a decade. He walked forward, his own tailored suit a stark contrast to the child's poverty. He stopped before the guards, his eyes never leaving the little girl. Then he looked at his mother, a lifetime of disappointment in his gaze, and delivered the words that would shatter their world far more effectively than any champagne flute. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. "That's my sister." The silence that followed was a physical entity, a thick, suffocating blanket that smothered the soft strains of the string quartet and the polite murmur of gossip. For a moment, the only sound was the frantic, terrified beating of 100 hearts in the chests of New York's elite. Damian's words hung in the air, glittering and venomous, refusing to dissipate. Eleanor Sterling's face, a carefully preserved mask of aristocratic composure, finally cracked. A web of fine lines appeared around her eyes and mouth as her expression cycled through disbelief, confusion, and finally pure, unadulterated fury. "Don't be absurd, Damian," she spat, recovering her voice, though it was now brittle as spun glass. "You have one sister, and she is standing right over there, trying not to be mortified by this pathetic little scene you're creating." She gestured vaguely towards Clara, her 22-year-old daughter, who indeed looked as if she wanted the marble floor to swallow her whole. Clara was frozen mid-sip of her own champagne, her eyes wide, a perfect portrait of socialite horror. Her brother, Ethan, standing beside her, looked less horrified and more incensed, his jaw tight with the entitled anger of a young man who had never been truly inconvenienced in his life. The little girl, still pinned between the 2 guards, looked up at Damian. Her expression wasn't one of hope or relief, but of intense, searching curiosity, as if she were trying to solve a complex puzzle by studying the lines of his face. Damian ignored his mother's protest. He took another step forward and knelt, bringing himself down to the child's eye level. The movement was so fluid and unexpected that it seemed to suck all the remaining air from the room. Billionaires did not kneel, not on marble floors, not in front of high society, and certainly not for street urchins. "It's all right," he said, his voice now gentle, a tone no one in that room had ever heard him use. "They won't hurt you." He looked at the guards, and his eyes were flint. "I said, let her go." There was no hesitation this time. The hands vanished from the girl's shoulders as if they'd been burned. She didn't flinch. She simply continued to stare at Damien. He held out his hand. "My name is Damien. What's yours?" The girl hesitated for a fraction of a second, her gaze flickering towards the wooden box she held. "Lily," she whispered, her voice raspy, unused. "Lily," Damien repeated, a strange, sad smile touching his lips. It was a name he hadn't heard spoken aloud in 15 years. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this was her. His search was over. "Well, Lily," he said, his voice softening further, "it seems you've caused quite a stir. I think it's best we go somewhere quieter to talk." He stood up, taking her small, grimy hand in his. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was surprisingly strong. He turned to face his family, his expression once again a mask of cold control. "The party is over," he announced to the stunned assembly. "Thank you all for coming." It was a dismissal so absolute, so audacious, that it left no room for argument. The guests, sensing the violent schism that had just fractured the city's most powerful family, began to murmur and move towards the exit, their eyes darting between Damien, the shell-shocked Eleanor, and the small, silent child who was the catalyst for it all. They were desperate to leave, to get to their cars and their phones, to be the first to spread the story that would dominate the social landscape for months to come. Damien Sterling, back from his self-imposed exile, had returned with a beggar girl he claimed was his sister. Ethan finally found his voice. "Damien, what is this? Some kind of joke? A publicity stunt? You can't just walk in here after 10 years and—" "I can, and I have." Damien cut him off, his tone leaving no room for debate. "We will discuss this as a family. Later." He started to lead Lily towards the grand staircase, away from the prying eyes and the wreckage of the evening. Eleanor took a step forward, her composure finally shattering completely. "You will not bring that filth into this house," she cried, her voice rising to a shrill pitch that was utterly at odds with her refined image. "I don't know what game you're playing, but she is not a Sterling. She is nothing." Damien stopped at the foot of the stairs and turned. The look on his face was one of profound pity, and it was that look, more than anything else, that seemed to wound his mother to her very core. "She has more of our father in her little finger than you, Ethan. And Clara have in your entire bodies," he said, his voice low and carrying. "Her name is Lily Sterling, and she is my niece. She is our father's granddaughter, and from this moment on, she will be treated as such in this house. Is that understood?" He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and continued up the stairs, his hand protectively holding Lily's. The little girl looked back once, her hazel eyes, Richard Sterling's hazel eyes, sweeping over the stunned faces of the family below, before she disappeared with Damien into the quiet, shadowy upper floors of the mansion, leaving a storm of chaos and confusion in her wake. Upstairs, the world was a different universe. The thrumming tension of the ballroom faded, replaced by the hushed, almost reverent silence of the mansion's private quarters. The carpets were so thick they swallowed the sound of their footsteps. Portraits of long-dead Sterlings, their faces stern and disapproving, watched them from the walls. Lily's small hand was still engulfed in Damien's, and he could feel a faint tremor running through her. He led her past the guest suites and the family wings, towards his old rooms at the far end of the hall. A section of the house he knew would be untouched, preserved like a museum exhibit to the son who had abandoned them. He pushed open the heavy oak door. The air inside was still and smelled faintly of lemon polish and old books. The furniture was draped in white dust cloths, giving the room the appearance of a ghostly landscape. Damien flicked a switch, and a soft light bloomed from a desk lamp, illuminating a space that was Spartan and organized, a stark contrast to the opulent chaos of the rest of the house. Lily's eyes widened as she took it all in. She had never seen a room so large that was meant for only one person. It was bigger than the entire dormitory she shared with 20 other children at the St. Jude's Home for Foundlings. She let go of Damien's hand and walked slowly into the center of the room, her fingers trailing lightly over the covered shape of a sofa. She was still clutching her wooden box. Damien watched her, his heart a tight, aching knot in his chest. He had spent years and a small fortune trying to find his half-sister, Amelia. He had hired the best private investigators, chased down decade-old leads, and followed whispers through the city's underbelly. All of it had led to dead ends, until a month ago, when one of his operatives had finally found a death certificate for an Amelia Sterling, dead of pneumonia in a charity ward in the Bronx. The trail had ended there, with no mention of a child. He had assumed he was too late, that he had failed completely. And then tonight, this little girl had walked into the lion's den, carrying her mother's eyes and her grandfather's chin, looking for a family she had never known. "Are you hungry?" Damien asked, his voice softer than he intended. Lily shook her head, her gaze fixed on a large, framed photograph on the wall that had been left uncovered. It was a picture of a much younger Damien, a teenage boy with an easy smile, standing next to a handsome, graying man with kind, hazel eyes. Richard Sterling. "That was my father," Damien said, coming to stand beside her. "Your grandfather." Lily reached out a tentative finger and touched the glass over Richard's face. "My mama had a picture of him," she whispered, "in a locket. She said he was a good man. She said he didn't know about me." "He didn't," Damien confirmed, the old anger at his mother coiling in his gut. "But he would have loved you. Very much." He sank into a dust-covered armchair, the white sheet crinkling under his weight. He suddenly felt exhausted, the adrenaline of the confrontation draining away, leaving a profound weariness in its place. "Lily, where have you been living?" "St. Jude's," she said simply, "after Mama got sick." "And how did you get here? All the way downtown?" Lily finally looked away from the photograph and met his gaze. There was no fear in her eyes now, only a solemn gravity that was far too old for her years. "Mama told me that if anything ever happened to her, I should find the Sterling building. The big one with the eagle on top. She said I should show them the box. She said they would help." A bitter, humorless laugh escaped Damien's lips. She had more faith in them than she should have. He looked at the box in her hands. "May I?" he asked gently. Lily hesitated, her grip tightening for a moment. This box was her only link to her mother, the only tangible piece of her past. But then she looked at Damien's face, at the genuine kindness in his eyes, and she seemed to make a decision. She walked over and placed the box in his outstretched hands. It was made of a dark, unpolished wood with a simple brass latch. It felt light, almost empty. Damien's fingers trembled slightly as he lifted the latch. He half expected to see the locket she'd mentioned, perhaps a few faded letters. He was not prepared for what he found. Lying on a bed of worn velvet was not just the locket, but a thick bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. A birth certificate with the name Lily Sterling printed in crisp black ink, and a folded yellowed legal document. He picked up the document first, his breath catching in his throat as he recognized his father's elegant, sloping signature at the bottom. It was a trust, a substantial one, established 18 years ago in the name of Amelia Sterling, with a clause stipulating that upon her death, the entire principal and all accrued interest would pass to any issue she might have. It was airtight, drawn up by his father's personal lawyer, and it was undeniable proof. His father had not abandoned his first daughter. He had provided for her secretly, going against Eleanor's wishes. He picked up the letters. They were from Richard to Amelia, written over the course of nearly 2 decades. Damien read the first few lines of the one on top. My dearest Amelia, I know you must hate me for not being the father I should be. My weakness is no excuse, but please know that not a day goes by that I don't think of you. I see your artistic spirit in the world, everywhere. His vision blurred. This was it. The proof that would not only secure Lily's place in the family, but would also detonate the carefully constructed lies his mother had lived by for 30 years. He looked up at Lily, who was watching him with an unnerving stillness. She had no idea of the power she held in that small wooden box. She had come seeking shelter, a helping hand, and had instead brought a reckoning. Footsteps pounded in the hallway, and the door to his room was thrown open without the courtesy of a knock. Eleanor stood there, her face a mask of thunderous rage, flanked by a fuming Ethan and a pale, trembling Clara. The guests are gone, Eleanor announced, her voice dangerously low. Now, you will tell me what this is all about. You will tell me who this child is, and you will tell me why you felt the need to publicly humiliate your own family. Damien didn't flinch. He slowly and deliberately placed the trust document on the small table beside his chair. Then he picked up one of the letters. He looked not at his mother, but at his younger siblings. This is Lily, he said calmly. She is the daughter of Amelia Sterling. Amelia was our father's first child, our older sister. Ethan let out a scornful laugh. Older sister? Dad didn't have another daughter? You're insane. Am I? Damien's eyes bored into his brother's. Or were you just too self-absorbed to ever question the perfect narrative Mommy spoon-fed you your whole life? He turned his attention back to Eleanor, whose face had gone deathly pale. She was staring at the letters in his hand. A flicker of something, recognition, fear, in her eyes. Father fell in love with a woman named Isabel when he was very young, before he ever met you, Damien continued, his voice relentless, laying the truth bare in the sterile, lamplit room. They had a daughter, Amelia. Grandfather Sterling disapproved, of course. Isabel wasn't from the right family, the right social circle. He forced them apart. Father, being the dutiful son he was, eventually complied. He married you, the socially acceptable choice. But he never stopped loving his daughter. He tried to be a part of her life, but you? His gaze locked onto Eleanor's. You made that impossible. You saw her as a threat, a stain on the Sterling name. You forced him to cut ties. That's a lie, Eleanor whispered, but there was no conviction in her voice. "He provided for her," Damien went on, ignoring her, his voice rising with a righteous anger that had been simmering for a decade. "He set up a trust. He wrote her letters. He loved her from a distance because you were too proud and too cruel to allow him to do otherwise. I found out when I was 17. I found a letter he'd dropped. I wanted to meet her, to know her. But you forbade it. You threatened to cut me off, to disown me. That, Mother, is why I left. Not because I was rebellious or ungrateful, but because I could not stand to be in the same house as a woman who would force a man to abandon his own child." He stood up, holding out the letter in his hand. "Amelia died a month ago. This is her daughter, our niece, our blood. She came here because her mother told her this family would protect her. And what did you do? You called her filth and tried to have her thrown into the street." He tossed the letter onto the table next to the trust document. It landed with a soft, damning whisper. "So you ask me what this is all about? This is about a lie that has lasted for 30 years, and tonight the lie is over." Clara let out a small sob, her hand flying to her mouth. Ethan stared, speechless, his arrogant smirk wiped clean from his face, replaced by a look of dawning horror and confusion. But Eleanor's face had crumpled. The rage was gone, replaced by a raw, gaping wound of exposure. The secrets she had buried, the choices she had made to protect her perfect world, had all been exhumed and laid bare under the unforgiving light of Damien's judgment, all because of the small, silent girl who stood watching, her mother's legacy clutched in a little wooden box. The ensuing silence in Damien's old room was heavier and more profound than the one that had fallen over the ballroom. It was a silence filled with the weight of unspoken history, of decades of deceit now laid bare. Clara was the first to break, her sobs becoming audible, hiccuping gasps of someone whose entire reality had been violently reconfigured. Ethan just stood there, his mouth slightly agape, looking back and forth between Damien and his mother, as if watching a tennis match where the ball had suddenly exploded. Eleanor, however, seemed to have turned to stone. All the color had drained from her face, leaving her skin the color of old parchment. Her eyes, usually so sharp and calculating, were unfocused, staring at the documents on the table as if they were venomous snakes. The fury was gone, replaced by a chilling, brittle emptiness. Lily, who had been a silent observer to this family detonation, took a small, almost imperceptible step closer to Damien. It was a simple, instinctual movement, seeking proximity to the only source of safety in a room crackling with emotional danger. Damien noticed. He put a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of both reassurance for her and a clear statement of allegiance to the others. "So," he said, his voice dropping back to its dangerously calm register, "this is where we are. Lily is here to stay. She is a Sterling, and she will be afforded every privilege, every opportunity, and every ounce of respect that name entails." "You can't just decide that," Ethan finally managed to say, his voice a hoarse whisper. This is our home." "It was our father's home," Damien corrected him coldly. "And this is his granddaughter. Do you have a problem with honoring his legacy, Ethan? Or is your inheritance the only part of him you care about?" The accusation hit its mark. Ethan flinched as if struck, color rushing back into his face. The truth was, he had barely known his father. Richard Sterling had always been a distant, melancholy figure, a man who seemed to prefer the solitude of his study to the company of his younger children. Ethan had always resented him for it, a resentment his mother had carefully nurtured, framing Richard's distance as a byproduct of the immense pressures of running the Sterling Empire. Now, a new, sickening possibility began to dawn on him, that his father's distance wasn't about business, but about a grief he was forced to bear alone. Eleanor finally moved. She walked forward with stiff, jerky steps, like a marionette whose strings had been tangled. She reached the table and looked down at the documents. Her hand, adorned with a diamond the size of a robin's egg, trembled as she reached for the trust agreement. She read it, her eyes scanning the legal jargon, her expression unchanging. Then she picked up one of the letters, her gaze falling upon her late husband's familiar script. Her breath hitched, a tiny, wounded sound. "He told me he had ended it," she whispered, her voice a hollow echo of its former power. "He promised me." "He ended contact," Damien said, his voice devoid of sympathy, "because you forced him to. But he never, ever stopped being her father. He did what he could, from a distance, to ensure she was cared for. Something you would never have done." Eleanor dropped the letter as if it had burned her. She looked up, and for the first time her eyes met Lily's. In that moment, the carefully constructed walls of her denial seemed to crumble. She wasn't just seeing a street urchin anymore. She was seeing Richard's eyes, Richard's chin, a living, breathing ghost of the man she had married, a testament to a part of his life she had tried and failed to erase. The sight seemed to break something deep inside her. "Get her out of my sight," she said, her voice cracking, turning away. I can't look at her." "She isn't going anywhere," Damien stated flatly. "But you are. The party's over, Mother. The performance is done. You can go to your room and mourn the end of your perfect lie. Clara, Ethan, you too. We have nothing more to discuss tonight." He was dismissing them. From his own long-abandoned room, he was dismissing the very people who had lived in this house every day of their lives. It was an astonishing power play, and it worked. Ethan, for once in his life, seemed to have no retort. He looked at his mother's shattered expression, at his sister's tear-streaked face, at the small, resolute girl standing beside his formidable older brother, and he simply turned and walked out, the fight gone out of him. Clara followed, her sobs muffled in her hands. Eleanor was the last to move. She stood with her back to them for a long moment, her shoulders slumped. The imperious matriarch was gone, replaced by an old, defeated woman. Without another word, she swept from the room, leaving behind a silence that felt blessedly clean. The storm had passed for now. Damien let out a long, slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He looked down at Lily. Her face was pale, and her eyes were wide. But she wasn't crying. She was just watching, absorbing everything with a preternatural calm. "I'm sorry you had to see that," he said, his voice filled with a weariness that went bone deep. Lily just shook her head. "Mama said people are complicated." Damien managed a small, sad smile. "Your mother was a very wise woman." He looked around the room, at the ghost-like furniture and the cold, unlived-in air. This wasn't a place for a child. This whole house, steeped in bitterness and secrets, wasn't a place for her. But for tonight, it would have to do. "You must be exhausted," he said. "Let's find you a proper room, one without so many ghosts." He led her out of his old room and down the hall to a large, beautifully appointed guest suite, decorated in soft shades of cream and blue. It had a canopied bed that looked like a cloud, and a private bathroom bigger than Lily's entire sleeping area at the orphanage. She stared at it all with a kind of detached wonder, as if she were looking at a picture in a book. Damien opened the closet and found a thick, soft robe. He turned on the water in the enormous porcelain tub. "Why don't you take a warm bath?" he suggested. "I'll have Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, find you something comfortable to sleep in. And I'll have some food sent up. What would you like?" "You can have anything you want." Lily thought for a moment, a flicker of some childlike emotion finally breaking through her solemn composure. "Macaroni and cheese?" she asked, her voice small. A lump formed in Damien's throat. Of all the things he could offer her, filet mignon, lobster, caviar, she wanted the simplest, most comforting food imaginable. "Macaroni and cheese it is," he said, his voice thick. "The best you've ever had." He left her to her bath and went downstairs, his mind racing. The first battle was won, but the war was far from over. He knew his family. Their shock would soon curdle into resentment and strategic maneuvering. Ethan would worry about his share of the inheritance. Clara would be concerned with the social fallout. And his mother? His mother would retreat, regroup, and look for a way to regain control. They would likely try to prove Lily was a fraud, a grifter his bleeding heart brother had dragged in to spite them. They would hire lawyers, private investigators. The irony was, he had already done their work for them. The contents of that box were irrefutable. But the legal truth and the emotional truth were two very different things. He found Mrs. Gable, a kind, motherly woman who had worked for the family since before he was born, and was one of the few people in the house he trusted. He explained the situation in simple, direct terms, omitting the decades of family drama. "This is Lily, my niece. She will be staying with us. She needs clothes, food, and to be made to feel welcome. She is to be treated as a member of this family. Is that clear?" Mrs. Gable's eyes widened slightly at the news, but her expression was one of compassion, not judgment, as she looked towards the grand staircase. "Of course, Mr. Damien. The poor dear. I'll take care of everything." Damien then went to the study, the one place in the house that had always been his father's sanctuary. He poured himself a stiff Scotch and sat in his father's worn leather chair. On the desk was a silver-framed photograph of his mother, Ethan, Clara, and himself, taken about a year before he left. They were all smiling, a perfect, happy family, a perfect, happy lie. He had thought that by leaving, by building his own world, free of his mother's suffocating control and her poisonous secrets, he had escaped. But he saw now that he had only been running. The poison had still been there, festering. Lily's arrival hadn't started the sickness. It had simply lanced the boil. For the first time in 10 years, he felt a flicker of something other than anger towards his father. He felt a profound, sorrowful empathy. He now understood the melancholy that had always clung to Richard Sterling like a shroud. It was the grief of a man forced to live a half-life, torn between the family he had and the daughter he'd been forced to leave behind. Damien took a long drink of his Scotch. He had brought Lily here to give her a home, to honor his father's memory and fulfill the duty he felt towards his lost sister. But as he sat alone in the dark, he realized his task was far greater. He wasn't just bringing a new member into the Sterling family. He was going to have to rebuild the family from the ashes of its own secrets, whether they wanted him to or not. The next morning, the mansion was unnaturally quiet, thick with the residue of the previous night's explosion. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, but it did nothing to dispel the oppressive gloom. Damien had barely slept, his mind a whirlwind of strategy and a deep, unfamiliar anxiety. It was one thing to make a grand, dramatic entrance and issue ultimatums. It was another thing entirely to manage the messy, complicated aftermath. He found Lily already awake. She was sitting on the edge of the enormous canopied bed in her guest room, dressed in a simple, clean nightgown Mrs. Gable had found for her. Her wet hair had been gently towel-dried and was beginning to curl around her small face. The grime was gone, revealing a pale, delicate complexion and a spray of faint freckles across her nose. With the dirt washed away, her resemblance to the old photographs of Richard Sterling was even more pronounced. She had his eyes, his mouth, the same thoughtful set to her jaw. She was watching the sun rise over the park, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her wooden box was on the bedside table, placed with care. "Good morning," Damien said from the doorway. Lily turned, a small shy smile touching her lips for the first time. "Good morning. The bed is very soft." "I'm glad," he said, walking into the room. "I've asked Mrs. Gable to arrange for a proper breakfast, but first I thought we might need to go shopping." He gestured to the simple nightgown. "I imagine you could use some clothes." Lily looked down at the borrowed gown, then back at him. "Okay," she said simply. There was no childish excitement, just a quiet acceptance. Her composure was both remarkable and heartbreaking. It was the composure of a child who had learned not to expect anything, to take what was given without complaint. Before they could discuss it further, there was a sharp knock on the door. It was Ethan. He was dressed in a pristine running outfit, but he didn't look like he'd been exercising. His face was pale and drawn, and there were dark circles under his eyes. "Damien, can I talk to you?" he asked, his voice strained. He pointedly did not look at Lily. "We are talking," Damien replied, his tone cool. "Lily and I were just discussing our plans for the day." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Alone?" "No," Damien said flatly. "Whatever you have to say, you can say it in front of my niece." The word niece was a deliberate jab, and Ethan flinched. He took a deep breath, clearly struggling with a decision. Finally, he stepped into the room, leaving the door ajar. "I spoke to Mother this morning," he began, his voice low. "She's not well. She's retained Julian Croft." Damien felt a surge of irritation. Julian Croft was the family's lead attorney, a shark in a Savile Row suit, known for his ability to make any problem or person disappear. "Of course she did," Damien said with a sigh. "I expected as much." "He's already started a preliminary investigation," Ethan continued, a note of desperation creeping into his voice. "He's looking for proof. Birth certificates, school records, anything that can verify this story." "Then he'll find it," Damien said calmly, picking up Lily's wooden box. "It's all in here. A birth certificate listing Amelia Sterling as the mother, and father unknown. A courtesy, no doubt, to protect our family's precious reputation. Letters from our father spanning 17 years. A legally ironclad trust. Croft will find that his work has already been done for him." He handed the box to Ethan. See for yourself." Ethan looked at the box as if it were radioactive. He hesitated, then took it, his hands clumsy. He sat on a chaise lounge near the window and opened the lid. He read the birth certificate first, his brow furrowed in concentration. Then he sifted through the letters, his expression shifting from skepticism to confusion, and finally to a dawning, horrified belief. He spent a long time staring at the trust document, at the familiar signature at the bottom. "This is real," he whispered, looking up at Damien. It wasn't a question. "All of this is real." "Yes, Ethan, it's real," Damien said, his voice softening slightly. For the first time, he saw a crack in his brother's arrogant facade, a glimmer of the confused young man beneath. "Dad had another daughter, a whole other life we knew nothing about." "Mother knew," Ethan said, his voice flat. He looked at the letters again. "She knew, and she lied. Her whole life. Our whole lives." The betrayal was stark on his face. Ethan had always been a mama's boy, his worldview shaped and curated by Eleanor. To discover that the foundation of his world was built on a lie was clearly shaking him to his core. He looked over at Lily, really looked at her for the first time. He saw the resemblance now, the ghost of his father in her small face. The sight seemed to solidify his distress into a new, unfamiliar emotion. Guilt. "Last night," he started, his voice faltering. "The things we said, the way we looked at you." He was speaking to Lily, his gaze fixed on her. I'm sorry." Lily just looked at him, her expression unreadable. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was more than he deserved. Just then, Clara appeared in the open doorway, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She was holding a tablet, her face pale with shock. "Damien," she said, her voice trembling. "It's everywhere. The Post, the Times, all the blogs. Someone at the party must have called a reporter the second they got to their car." She held up the tablet. The screen showed the online page of a major gossip column. The headline was splashed across the top in bold, garish letters. "Sterling Succession Shocker. Billionaire Bastion. Rocked by Mystery Heiress." Below it was a blurry cell phone picture of Damien kneeling in front of Lily in the ballroom, with Eleanor's horrified face visible in the background. "They're calling her the Sterling Cinderella," Clara whispered, scrolling down. "They're speculating about her mother, about father. They're tearing us apart." Damien had expected this, but the speed and viciousness of it were still jarring. The society that had once fawned over his family was now turning on them, eager to witness the downfall of the mighty. "Let them talk," Damien said, though a cold anger was building inside him. "Their opinions are meaningless." "Meaningless," Clara cried, her voice rising with hysteria. "My friends are all calling me. The board of the charity is texting. Everyone wants to know who she is. What am I supposed to say?" "You're supposed to say she's your niece," Damien said, his voice hard as steel. "You're supposed to say she's family. And if any of your so-called friends have a problem with that, then they were never your friends to begin with." He walked over to the window, looking down at the manicured lawns of the estate. The walls of the mansion suddenly felt like a cage. He had brought Lily here to protect her, but he had instead thrown her into a piranha tank. The media, his own family, the prying eyes of the world, they would all try to pick her apart. "Our plans have changed," he said, turning back to the room. "We're not going shopping. Not yet. The first thing we need to do is control the narrative." He looked at Ethan, who was still holding the box, a lost look on his face. "Ethan, call Croft. Tell him to cancel his investigation and instead prepare a statement. A simple one. It will confirm that Lily is Richard Sterling's granddaughter and that the family is delighted to welcome her home. No more details." Then he turned to Clara. "Clara, you're going to use that social media addiction of yours for something useful. You are going to post a picture of you and Lily. And you are going to write a caption that says, 'So happy to finally meet my beautiful niece, Lily. Welcome to the family.' You will be sincere, you will be welcoming, and you will block anyone who leaves a negative comment. Understood?" Clara stared at him, her mouth opening and closing. The idea of posting a picture with the disheveled girl who had ruined her mother's party was clearly abhorrent to her. But there was a new authority in Damien's voice, the authority of someone who held the truth, and she found herself unable to argue. She just nodded numbly. "Good," Damien said. He looked at Lily, who had been watching this whole exchange with her usual quiet intensity. "Lily," he said, kneeling in front of her, "I know this is a lot to take in, and I am so sorry that you are in the middle of this storm. But I promise you, I will not let anyone hurt you. We are going to get through this." Lily looked at him, then at the tearful Clara, and the guilt-ridden Ethan. She looked at the tablet with its cruel headline. She didn't seem frightened. She seemed resigned. "Mama said the world wasn't always a kind place," she said softly. "She said you have to be strong." "She was right," Damien said, his heart aching for the burdens this child had already been forced to bear. "And you are strong, stronger than all of them." He stood up and faced his siblings. "We have a choice to make," he said, his voice a low command. "We can let Mother's lies and the gossip columns tear this family apart for good, or we can stand together for the first time in a very long time and protect the most vulnerable member of our family. We can do what Father would have wanted. So, what's it going to be?" Ethan looked down at the letters in his lap, at the tangible proof of his father's secret love and regret. Clara looked at the picture on her tablet, at the image of a world that was turning against her. They both looked at Lily, this small, silent child who was the embodiment of a truth they could no longer deny. The Sterling Empire had been built on secrets and lies, but its future now depended on a single, fragile truth. And for the first time, it seemed that Damien was not the only one willing to fight for it. The next few days passed in a blur of carefully managed chaos. True to Damien's command, the Sterling machine, once geared towards secrecy and denial, was slowly and painstakingly recalibrated towards acceptance and control. Julian Croft, after a tense, hour-long phone call with Damien, in which the contents of the wooden box were described in unflinching detail, changed his tune from adversarial to advisory. A crisp, formal press release was issued. It was a masterpiece of corporate speak, confirming the existence of a previously unknown granddaughter, and stating that the Sterling family was overjoyed to be unified, and requested privacy during this sensitive time. It was just enough information to starve the media frenzy of oxygen without providing any new, scandalous details to fuel the fire. Clara, to her credit, did as she was told. After 2 hours of agonizing in her room, she emerged with a determined, if fragile, look on her face. She found Lily in the library, where Damien had left her with a stack of illustrated classic novels. Clara had brought a designer dress from one of her old collections, a simple, elegant blue silk that she thought might fit. Lily looked up from her book, her expression cautious. "Hi," Clara said, her voice still shaky. I brought you this. I thought you might like it. For the picture." Lily looked at the dress, then back at Clara. She didn't say anything. Clara's resolve faltered. "It's okay if you don't like it," she said quickly. "We can find something else. I just thought—" Lily finally spoke. "It's pretty," she said softly. "Thank you." Relieved, Clara helped her change. The dress was a little big, but the color brought out the warm flecks in Lily's hazel eyes. Clara then hesitated before reaching out and gently brushing Lily's hair, smoothing it down. It was an awkward, tentative gesture, but it was the first act of kindness Clara had shown. They took the picture on the grand staircase in the exact spot where the family had been shattered 2 nights before. Clara put her arm around Lily's shoulders, a gesture that felt both staged and, surprisingly, a little protective. She posted it with the caption Damien had dictated. The comment section exploded almost instantly, a mix of shock, support, and vile speculation. True to her word, Clara sat for hours, diligently deleting the negative comments and blocking the worst offenders, her fingers flying across the screen of her phone. It was a shallow, superficial battle, but it was a battle she was fighting on Lily's behalf. And in doing so, a small, unfamiliar seed of solidarity began to take root. Ethan, meanwhile, retreated into the family's business archives. After his initial shock and guilt, his pragmatic, business-oriented mind had taken over. He wasn't just accepting Lily's existence. He was verifying it with the cold, hard logic of numbers. He cross-referenced the trust document with his father's private financial records, finding a clear, decades-long trail of discrete payments and investments that perfectly matched. The evidence was overwhelming. His father hadn't just signed a document. He had actively, secretly, managed his daughter, Amelia's financial security for her entire life. The discovery shifted something fundamental in Ethan. His resentment towards his distant father began to curdle into a reluctant admiration. His father had played a long, secret game against his own wife to do the right thing. The realization made Ethan look at his own life, a life of effortless privilege, of coasting on the family name, with a new, uncomfortable sense of inadequacy. Throughout all of this, Eleanor remained secluded in her wing of the mansion. She refused to see anyone, communicating only through terse notes delivered by her personal maid. She was a ghost in her own home, her absence a palpable presence. Damien knew it was a strategic retreat. She was waiting, observing, trying to understand the new dynamics of the family before she made her next move. Damien's focus, however, was solely on Lily. He spent his days with her, trying to build a bridge across the years of silence and neglect. He discovered she was quiet, but not shy. She was a keen observer, watching everything with an intelligent, discerning gaze. She had her mother's artistic spirit. She would spend hours sketching in a notepad he'd bought for her, her drawings surprisingly detailed and imaginative. She spoke of her mother, Amelia, not with sadness, but with a deep, abiding love. She told him stories of their small, sunlit apartment in the Bronx, of trips to the museum on free admission days, of a life that was poor in material wealth, but rich in affection. Through Lily's stories, Damien began to know the sister he had never met. He saw Amelia not as a secret or a victim, but as a vibrant, resilient woman who had raised a remarkable daughter on her own. One afternoon, as they were sitting in the garden, Damien asked her, "Lily, when you came to the party, what were you hoping for? What did you want from us?" Lily looked up from her drawing of a squirrel. She seemed to consider the question seriously. "Mama said family is supposed to keep you safe," she said. "She told me that if she was gone, I should find her family, and they would keep me safe. That's all." It was so simple, so pure. She hadn't come for money, or a mansion, or a famous name. She had come for safety, a basic, fundamental need that his family, in their wealth and power, had so spectacularly failed to provide. The weight of his responsibility settled more heavily on his shoulders. That evening, Damien decided it was time to confront the ghost. He went to his mother's wing and, ignoring the protests of her maid, walked into her private sitting room. Eleanor was standing by the window, looking out at the city lights. She was dressed impeccably, as always, but her face in the dim light looked aged and fragile. "The press has gone quiet," she said without turning around. "Your strategy seems to have worked. For now." "This isn't about strategy, Mother," Damien said, his voice even. "This is about a little girl who has lost everything. This is about your granddaughter." "She is not my granddaughter," Eleanor said, her voice cold and brittle. "She is the product of your father's infidelity, a symbol of his betrayal." "He knew Amelia's mother before he ever met you," Damien countered, his patience wearing thin. "There was no betrayal. The only betrayal was yours, when you forced him to choose between his duty to the family name and his love for his child." Eleanor finally turned to face him. Her eyes were hard, her face an unyielding mask. "I did what I had to do to protect this family, to protect you and Ethan and Clara. Her existence threatened everything I had built, everything we had." "What did you build?" Damien asked, his voice rising. "A house of lies? A family so brittle that the mere existence of one more child could shatter it? That's not strength, Mother, that's weakness. It's fear." "You call it fear. I call it pragmatism," she shot back. "And what would you know of it? You ran away. You abandoned your responsibilities. You left me here to hold it all together." "I left because I couldn't breathe in the rarefied air of your hypocrisy," he thundered, his control finally snapping. "You talk about protecting this family, but you have been the one poisoning it from the inside for 30 years. Your pride, your obsession with appearances, your cold, calculating heart, that is what has been destroying us, not some poor, innocent woman and her child." He was breathing heavily, the words he had held back for a decade finally unleashed. Eleanor flinched, a flicker of pain in her eyes, but she did not back down. "And what is your solution?" she asked, her voice dripping with scorn. "To bring the poison right into the heart of the house? To parade this girl in front of the world and invite their judgment? You think this will fix anything? You are a fool. A naive, sentimental fool, just like your father." "My father was a good man who was trapped in a gilded cage with a heartless warden," Damien said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "He made one mistake in his life, and it wasn't fathering Amelia. It was marrying you." The cruelty of the remark hung in the air between them. It was a mortal blow, and Damien knew it. He saw the last of the fight drain out of his mother. Her shoulders slumped, and she seemed to shrink before his eyes. She sank into a chair, her face in her hands. She didn't weep, but a dry, rattling sob escaped her. Damien felt a pang of something, not regret, but a deep, sorrowful pity. He had won. He had broken her, but it felt like a hollow victory. He had come for a confrontation, but he had no idea what to do with the wreckage. He turned to leave. "Damien," she said, her voice muffled by her hands. He stopped, his back to her. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice filled with a despair that was utterly genuine. "What do you expect me to do?" Damien was silent for a long moment. What did he want? He wanted to undo the past 30 years. He wanted Lily to have her mother back. He wanted his father to have known his granddaughter. He wanted a family that was built on love, not lies. But none of that was possible. "I want you to be a grandmother," he said softly, without turning around. "I want you to go downstairs, find that little girl who is sleeping in a guest room, and show her one single, solitary ounce of human kindness. That's all. That's where we start." He walked out, leaving her alone in the darkness, the weight of his simple, impossible request settling around her like a shroud. The house remained in a state of fragile truce for the rest of the week. Damien's words to his mother seemed to have had an effect, though not the one he'd hoped for. Eleanor did not emerge from her rooms to offer an olive branch to Lily. Instead, she simply ceased her opposition. A silent, cold war settled over the mansion. Julian Croft was no longer on the attack, but on retainer for reputational management. No more attempts were made to discredit Lily. The family, at least on the surface, was presenting a united front. But the atmosphere was thick with unspoken resentment. Lily, with the uncanny sensitivity of a child accustomed to navigating adult emotions, felt it acutely. She became even quieter, more withdrawn, sticking close to Damien, or the comforting, non-judgmental presence of Mrs. Gable. She spent most of her time in the library or the garden, creating a small, safe world for herself within the vast, cold opulence of the estate. Damien knew this couldn't last. They were living in a holding pattern, a gilded cage where the politeness was as sharp as broken glass. The real problem was Eleanor. As long as she refused to accept Lily, the family would remain fractured, and Lily would never truly feel safe or welcome. The breaking point came in an unexpected way. One rainy afternoon, Damien took Lily into the city. He had arranged for a private appointment at a high-end department store to buy her a proper wardrobe. As they were leaving, shielded by a large umbrella held by their driver, a pack of paparazzi, who had clearly been tipped off, descended on them. The sudden explosion of flashing cameras and shouted questions was terrifying. "Damien, is she really your father's love child? What's her name? How much is she going to inherit?" The questions were brutal, invasive. Damien wrapped a protective arm around Lily, trying to shield her as he pushed through the throng towards the car. Lily was trembling, her face buried in his coat. But just as they reached the car door, one photographer, a particularly aggressive man, shoved his camera right in Lily's face. "Hey, kid, smile for the camera. How does it feel to be a millionaire?" he yelled. Lily flinched back, her eyes wide with terror, and in that moment something inside Damien snapped. The cold, controlled billionaire vanished, replaced by a fiercely protective guardian. He turned, grabbed the camera, and hurled it to the wet pavement, where it shattered into 100 pieces. "Get away from her," he snarled, his voice a low, dangerous growl that cut through the chaos. "She is a child. If any of you ever come near her again, I will personally ruin you." The paparazzi, stunned by his raw fury, fell back, Damien bundled Lily into the car, and they sped away, leaving the stunned photographers and the broken camera on the sidewalk. Back in the car, Lily was shaking uncontrollably, silent tears streaming down her face. Damien pulled her into a hug, his heart pounding with a mixture of rage and guilt. He had brought her into this world, and he had failed to protect her from its ugliest side. "I'm so sorry, Lily," he whispered, stroking her hair. "I'm so sorry." "They hate me," she sobbed into his chest. "Why do they hate me?" "They don't hate you, sweetheart," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "They don't even know you. They're just cruel. It's a game to them." But he knew his words were little comfort. The damage had been done. When they returned to the mansion, the story was already breaking online. Billionaire's rampage. Damien Sterling assaults photographer to protect mystery girl. The narrative was already being twisted. He was being painted as unstable, violent. It was exactly the kind of ammunition his mother's allies in the media could use against them. He took Lily straight to her room, where Mrs. Gable clucked over her, bringing her warm milk and wrapping her in a soft blanket. Damien went in search of his mother. He found her in the conservatory, calmly pruning her prize-winning orchids. She had her tablet next to her, and he knew she had already seen the news. "Happy now?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "This is the world you were so desperate to protect. This is the judgment you were so afraid of." Eleanor didn't look up from her flower. "I warned you, Damien. The world is not a kind place. You threw a lamb to the wolves, and you are surprised she got bitten?" "She is not a lamb, and I am not surprised," he shot back. "I am furious. Furious that she has to endure this. Furious that this family is so broken that a pack of vultures feels they have the right to tear apart a grieving child for sport." "And your little outburst will certainly help matters," Eleanor said coolly, snipping off a dead leaf. "Violence, so common. It only confirms their theories that this is all some sordid, low-class drama." The callousness of her words, the way she could twist his protective rage into a social faux pas, finally pushed Damien over the edge. "To hell with your theories!" he roared, striding forward and sweeping his arm across a workbench, sending pots, soil, and delicate orchid blooms crashing to the floor. "To hell with your appearances and your social standing. A little girl was terrorized today. Your granddaughter was terrorized. And all you can think about is how it will look in the society pages. Have you no heart? Have you no soul?" Eleanor finally looked at him, and for the first time he saw not anger or pride, but fear. A deep, profound fear. But it wasn't fear of him. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You think this is about pride, about snobbery. It isn't." "Then what is it about?" Damien demanded. "Why are you so determined to hate this child?" Eleanor sank onto a small iron bench, her hands twisting in her lap. The story came out in a torrent, a confession that had been dammed up for 30 years. "When your father told me about Amelia," she began, her voice barely audible, "I was devastated. Not just because he had loved someone else, but because of who she was. Her mother, Isabel, was from nothing. No family, no breeding. And Amelia was an artist, a dreamer. Everything the Sterlings were not. I just knew that if she were brought into this family, she would be destroyed. This world, our world, it eats people like that alive. It would have judged her, mocked her, torn her to pieces for not being one of us. I saw it happen to your father's cousin, who married an actor. I saw how they were treated. I saw the whispers, the snubs, the casual cruelty. She looked up at Damien, her eyes pleading for him to understand. I told your father he had to choose, not because I was jealous, but because I wanted to protect her. I thought if he let her go, if she grew up away from all this, she could have a normal, happy life. A life free from the weight of the Sterling name. It was a cruelty, I know it was. But I thought it was a necessary one. A kindness, in its own twisted way. Damien stared at her, stunned into silence. Of all the reasons he had imagined for his mother's actions, greed, pride, jealousy, he had never once considered this. A horribly misguided act of protection. And when you showed up with her, Eleanor continued, her voice breaking, with Lily. I looked at her, and I saw Amelia all over again. I saw this innocent, fragile child. And all I could think was that you were dragging her into the same cage I had tried to keep her mother out of. When I told the guards to get her out, it wasn't just because she was dirty. It was because I wanted to save her. I wanted to send her back to a world where she could be anonymous and safe. And now look what's happened. The paparazzi, the stories, it's all coming true. It's starting all over again. She finally broke, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. Damien stood amidst the wreckage of the orchids, the scent of damp earth and crushed flowers filling the air. His anger had evaporated, replaced by a dizzying, complicated wave of emotions. His mother wasn't a monster. She was just a woman who had made a terrible, life-altering mistake for what she believed were the right reasons. She had chosen the wrong way to love, the wrong way to protect, and had ended up poisoning everything she touched. He walked over and sat down beside her on the bench. He didn't touch her. He just sat there, in the quiet conservatory, as the rain pattered against the glass roof. "You were wrong," he said softly, after a long time. "You were wrong to think that keeping them away was protecting them. The safest place for Amelia, and for Lily, was never away from this family. It was in it, with us. To be loved and accepted and defended. That's real protection, not hiding them away from the world." Eleanor looked up, her face streaked with tears. "But how do we do that?" she whispered. "How do we defend her against all that?" "We do it together," Damien said, his voice firm with a newfound conviction. "No more secrets, no more lies. We don't hide her, we celebrate her. We show the world that she is a Sterling, and that we are proud to have her. We show them that our family is stronger than their gossip, and our love is stronger than their hate." He stood up and held out his hand to her. "But it has to start with you, Mother. You are the queen of this world. Your acceptance is the only thing that will silence the jackals. They follow your lead. You have the power to end this." Eleanor looked at his outstretched hand, then up at his face. For the first time in a decade, she saw not the rebellious son who had abandoned her, but the strong, principled man he had become. A man like his father. She saw the truth in his words. Her strategy of cutting out the perceived weakness had failed. It had only made the family weaker. Now her son was proposing a new strategy. Radical, terrifying, but perhaps the only one that could truly save them. With a trembling hand, she placed her own in his and allowed him to help her to her feet. It was not a surrender. It was an alliance. The next morning, Eleanor Sterling did something she hadn't done in years. She came down for breakfast, She entered the formal dining room, not in one of her formidable power suits, but in a soft cashmere sweater set, her hair styled simply, her face pale but composed. Ethan and Clara, already at the table, stared at her as if she were an apparition. Damien, who was sitting with Lily, helping her cut her pancakes, simply looked up and gave his mother a small, encouraging nod. Lily froze, a piece of pancake halfway to her mouth, her eyes wide with apprehension. She remembered this woman's cruel words, her cold eyes. Eleanor walked to the table, and instead of taking her usual seat at the head, she pulled out the chair, directly next to Lily. The move was so unexpected that for a moment no one spoke. Eleanor sat down and turned to the little girl. Her hands were trembling slightly where they rested on the tablecloth. "Good morning, Lily," she said, her voice soft, almost hesitant. I hear you had a difficult day yesterday. I am very sorry that happened to you." Lily stared at her, then glanced at Damien for reassurance. He gave another, almost imperceptible nod. "It's okay," Lily whispered, her voice barely audible. "No," Eleanor said, her voice gaining a little strength. "It is not okay. No child should be treated that way." She looked around the table, at her other children, then back at Lily. "This family, we have not done a very good job of making you feel welcome, of making you feel safe, and that is my fault. I have been wrong." The admission hung in the air, more shocking than any of Damien's revelations. Eleanor Sterling did not admit fault. She did not apologize. And yet she had. She turned her full attention back to Lily. "Your mother, Amelia. I never met her. It is one of the great regrets of my life. But your grandfather spoke of her. He told me she was a wonderful artist, very gifted." Lily's eyes lit up, the fear receding, replaced by a spark of pride. "She was," she said, her voice a little stronger. "She could draw anything. She taught me how." "I would like to see your drawings sometime," Eleanor said, "if you would let me." "Okay," Lily agreed, a tiny, hesitant smile appearing on her face. It was a small, fragile beginning, but it was a beginning. Over the next few days, a subtle but profound shift occurred within the mansion. Eleanor had, as Damien predicted, changed the emotional weather of the entire house. She began to purposefully, methodically, draw Lily into the family's orbit. She discovered that Lily loved the enormous koi pond in the garden, and she started spending an hour every morning with her there, telling her the names and histories of each of the ancient fish. She learned of Lily's love for art and unearthed Amelia's old sketchbooks from a trunk in the attic where Richard had secretly stored them. Together she and Lily would sit in the library, looking through the drawings of a young woman they were both coming to know through her art. For Eleanor, it was a painful, bittersweet penance. In the strokes of Amelia's charcoal drawings, she saw the free spirit her husband had loved, and she began to grieve for the daughter-in-law she had never known and the relationship she had willfully destroyed. For Lily, it was a miracle. She was not just being tolerated, she was being seen. This powerful, intimidating woman was showing a genuine interest in her thoughts, in her mother. The quiet, watchful child began to relax, to let her guard down. A real, genuine affection began to grow between the two. Ethan and Clara, following their mother's lead, also began to change. Ethan, having delved into his father's finances, found that the trust for Amelia had been funded not from the main Sterling accounts, but from Richard's own private, pre-marital investments. This wasn't company money. It was his father's personal legacy. The realization freed him from his fear about his own inheritance and allowed him to see Lily not as a competitor, but as the last living piece of a father he was only now beginning to understand. He discovered that Lily had a quick, logical mind and taught her how to play chess, the game Richard had tried and failed to teach him as a boy. To his surprise, Lily was a natural. They spent hours in the study, locked in silent, strategic battles, and in doing so, they forged an unlikely bond. Clara's transformation was perhaps the most surprising. After the initial shock of the social media storm, she discovered a new, unexpected purpose. She became Lily's fierce online protector. She created a private, family-only social media account where she posted pictures of Lily doing normal, happy things. Playing chess with Ethan, drawing with Eleanor, picking flowers in the garden. It was her way of reclaiming the narrative, of showing the world a truth they couldn't see. In the process, she found herself spending real, quality time with her niece. She took her shopping, not to dress her up like a doll, but to find clothes that Lily actually liked: comfortable jeans, soft sweaters, and brightly colored sneakers. She discovered that Lily had a wicked sense of humor and a contagious giggle, and for the first time in her life, Clara found herself enjoying the company of someone who didn't care about her clothes, her connections, or her social status. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place about a month after Lily's arrival. Damien had hired a new team of private investigators, not to dig for dirt, but to do what he should have done from the start: find out what Lily's life had been like. They discovered that Amelia, despite the trust fund, had lived a simple, frugal life. She had never touched the principal, living only off a small portion of the interest, determined to save the rest for her daughter's future. She had worked as a freelance illustrator and had been well loved in her small community. The investigators also found the name of the orphanage, St. Jude's Home for Foundlings, and Damien decided it was time to pay them a visit. He went alone, not wanting to subject Lily to any more trauma. He met with the director, a tired but kind woman named Mrs. Peterson. He made a substantial donation to the home, enough to ensure they wouldn't have to worry about funding for years. But he was there for another reason. "I wanted to thank you for taking care of my niece," he said. Mrs. Peterson smiled. "Lily is a special girl. We were all so fond of her, so resilient, so brave." She hesitated, then said, "You know, her mother prepared her for this, for the possibility of coming to you." She led Damien to her office and pulled a small sealed envelope from a file. "Amelia Sterling gave this to me when she first fell ill. She told me that if anything happened to her, and if Lily ever found her way to her father's family, I was to give this to you, to the family." Damien took the envelope. It was addressed simply to the Sterling family. His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in a graceful, artistic script. He read the letter, and the last of his anger, the last of his bitterness towards his family, finally melted away. That evening, he called them all together in the study: Eleanor, Ethan, Clara, and Lily. The atmosphere was no longer tense and hostile, but one of quiet, fragile peace. "I went to St. Jude's today," Damien began, "and the director gave me something from Amelia." He unfolded the letter and read it aloud, his voice thick with emotion. "To the family I never knew," he began. "If you are reading this, then my dearest Lily, has found you. I know this must be a shock, and I know my existence has been a difficult secret. I want you to know that I hold no anger for the choices that were made long ago. My father did his best to care for me from afar, and I am grateful for the life his provision allowed me to have. It was a good life, a happy one, and it gave me my Lily, which is the greatest gift of all. My only wish, my only prayer, is that you will see her for who she is, a loving, bright, wonderful child who deserves to be safe and cherished. She is not a secret or a scandal. She is just a little girl who needs a family. Please, love her as I have. See her heart. That is all I ask. With hope, Amelia Sterling. When he finished, the room was silent, save for the sound of Clara's quiet sniffling. Eleanor had tears streaming down her face, her hand held over her mouth. She stood up, walked over to Lily, and knelt before her, just as Damien had done on that first night. She took Lily's small hands in her own. "We will, Amelia," she whispered, as if speaking to the ghost in the room. Then she looked into Lily's eyes, her own filled with a deep, profound remorse and a dawning, fierce love. "We will," she repeated to her granddaughter. "I promise." A few months later, the Sterling Grand Ballroom was once again filled with people. But it was not a lavish gala. The guest list was small, intimate, family, and a few close friends. The occasion was Lily's 9th birthday. The room was decorated not with ostentatious flower arrangements, but with Lily's own drawings, framed and hung with care on the walls. Lily, dressed in a simple party dress, of her favorite color, yellow, was laughing, her face alight with a joy that had been absent when she first arrived. She was surrounded not by strangers, but by her family. Ethan was showing her a new checkmate strategy on a portable chessboard. Clara was helping her open presents, squealing with delight at each one. And Eleanor was standing by the cake, a genuine loving smile on her face, watching her granddaughter with an expression of pure adoration. Damien stood off to the side, a glass of champagne in his hand, watching the scene unfold. His family was not perfect. Their scars were still there, deep and real. But they were no longer a collection of individuals bound by secrets and obligations. They were a family, messy and complicated, but finally whole. Eleanor caught his eye from across the room and raised her glass to him in a silent toast. A toast of gratitude, of forgiveness, of a shared, hard-won peace. Damien smiled and raised his glass in return. He looked at Lily, who was now blowing out the candles on her cake, her family's loving faces illuminated by the soft glow. The little girl who had walked into their lives like a silent storm had, in the end, been the one to bring them all safely to shore. She hadn't come for their money or their name. She had come for their hearts. And in giving her theirs, they had, against all odds, found their own again.